Big part of our responsibility in agriculture is to make sure we're farming as kindly to the environment as possible. And obviously, right now with climate change, Romania has felt that impact quite heavily the last 2 years, which we'll see in the results later on. We want to reduce our carbon footprint. So purely from the inputs, this is fuel, crop protection, fertilizer and seed, we can reduce our carbon footprint by over 10% just by changing the practices.
Mulțumesc, Max, pentru că ai acceptat invitația de a vorbi fermierilor APPR și partenerilor noștri despre un proiect drag nouă, echipei FAPPR și în egală măsură vouă, un proiect la care lucrăm împreună, un proiect în care vrem să vedem dacă agricultura regenerativă, un concept vehiculat mult în ultimul timp, este într-adevăr o oportunitate pentru fermierii din România sau mai degrabă o provocare. Este un proiect pe care ni l-ați încredințat, ați avut încredere în noi și iată că avem deja primele rezultate. Te invit să ne spui mai multe despre acest proiect al companiei Syngenta.
Yes, thank you very much. This has been quite an interesting development. So, yourselves, APPR, have been fantastic working with us to expand what was a pre-existing sort of network of farms we were looking at. So this all started out with Syngenta realizing originally conservation ag rather than regenerative ag was something that was growing from legislative need, growing from an environmental need, growing from grassroots grower interest. And we've got very good relationships with ECAF, the European Conservation and Agriculture Federation, and we decided, well, there's trials looking at parts of regen ag, parts of conservation ag, but they don't look at the whole system. You know, what happens when you go and totally change your tillage system, introduce green cover crops, vary your rotation? What happens to the agronomy? What happens to your operations? What happens to your fuel use? And then what does that mean for carbon? What does that mean for the environment? What does that mean then for the grower and their budget? You know, it has to be sustainable for the environment and it has to be sustainable for the business. So we launched a set of trials right across Europe. So the original trials, as you'll see on the map, we had the United Kingdom, we had Spain, and we had France. And they were purely looking at tillage, rotation, green cover crop inclusion. There's no variable input. It wasn't looking at products. It wasn't looking at fertilizer. It was just what happens when you change systems.
The pillars of the regenerative agriculture.
Obviously, the regenerative ag, depending on who you talk to, it's slightly different to conservation ag. But this still fills into the regenerative ag piece because we do have actually got livestock on these farms because that's how some of them get rid of their green cover crops. We do add manure in and we do try and reduce inputs where we can. So those were the initial sites and that started in 2017. So this has been a very long-running trial. This is probably my most important long-term trial. Generally inside R&D manufactured trials we do single seasons and you get a result, but you don't see long-term impact. Things like what happens to weed populations on long-term changes to practices. So in Romania, you actually already were doing this work within Syngenta, but on our Interra farm. But that wasn't looking at it in a big enough scale. It wasn't interacting with enough growers, and we wanted to have expertise external from Syngenta to really push that project on. So that's where, so 2 harvests ago, 3 years ago, we came and contacted yourselves and started that discussion how we would set up that trial. So we wanted to then expand this into a territory we've not done before. As you can see from the map, we've also expanded into Denmark, that's into the Nordic space, and there's also Portugal in the project now, but that's more of a tomato rotation, whereas the rest are arable. So this was the sort of premise. We wanted to get clear data, not arbitrary or anecdotal information on going to regen ag. What does that mean for your soil? What does that mean for your farm? What does that mean for the environment?
Așadar, am testat în România, am implementat acest proiect cu APPR în 2 regiuni diferite, așa cum voi faceți același lucru în alte state din Europa. Ce tip de date sperați, mizați să generați în cadrul acestui proiect?
So the results and what do we expect to get from them? So this is just a high-level overview of what we're seeing from the core projects that started in 2017. So these are benchmark results that we would expect to see from regenerative agriculture. So the results on screen are the benefit of going from a tillage system, which is 25, 30 centimetre inversion tillage, down to light till. So we call it light till because there's always going to be a bit of tillage. Even if it's straw raking, even if it's direct drilling with a tine or a disc drill. So we call it light till just to separate that out. So the key things we'd really expect is obviously the benefit to the soil. So the first result there, we had a huge increase in soil cover. So that's trash from the previous crop, that's green cover crops covering it over winter. And when we go to low till, it was the only way to hit those European targets of 30% ground cover. So we needed that, and that has directly impacted the amount of carbon we're storing in those systems. The key thing with this is that you do need to have low tillage and green cover crops in a system to have an increase in carbon. So because we're increasing carbon in the soil, we're not disturbing it as much. We also found that the earthworm numbers went up quite rapidly. It was quite a fast response. Most of the time people talk about 5, 10, 15 years for soil to really change. This happened within a couple of years. You saw a very noticeable difference in earthworm numbers, which obviously are helping cycle that carbon, helping the system cycle nutrients as well. So those are the sort of biological factors. We also do things like VEST scores. So a VEST is a visual assessment of soil structure. So you're literally scoring how well structured the soil is. How is it aggregating? How good is that for infiltration of water? How easy will it be for crops to establish, basically? And we've seen an increase in that, obviously modest, 4%, but we all started on farms that had good scores to begin with, so there was only so much room for improvement. But still, even in those scenarios, we improved. But the key thing we were really interested in was carbon. Big part of our responsibility in agriculture is to make sure we're farming as kindly to the environment as possible. And obviously, right now with climate change, Romania has felt that impact quite heavily the last 2 years, which we'll see in the results later on. We want to reduce our carbon footprint. So purely from the inputs, this is fuel, crop protection, fertilizer and seed, we can reduce our carbon footprint by over 10% just by changing the practices. Now, interestingly, some things will go up when you go to min-till and light-till, because you'll probably have more herbicides in the rotation. You might have more slug pellets. You might have to think about rodenticides. You will have more seed costs because you'll put a green cover crop in. But the fuel benefit from stopping plough completely outweighs that, and we see the return there. And the only negative that we really are finding, which completely agrees with literature, is that because we're not having as much tilth, we are reducing our seeds to soil contact, we reduce germination, establishment declines, and obviously lower establishment means lower yields, especially on large seeded crops. So field bean, maize, sunflower, particularly affected by that, and obviously very sensitive to population changes. So that does need to be kept in mind. So instantly what you can do is increase seed rates, and hopefully when we do that we can still get the net profit, because if you look at the very end on the right hand side you can see we actually do have a much improved net profit, even though we've got slightly reduced yield, and that's purely because we have got an increase in our, a decrease in our input costs, but maintaining relatively similar output costs, which is fantastic. And you can see that primarily comes from nearly over a 40% reduction in fuel use, which increases our efficiency and reduces our number of operations and operation costs. So that was Spain, UK, and France to sort of give an idea of what to expect. Now, that's not all we've measured. We've got about over 80,000 data points, so it's very hard to summarize, but it gives you a taste. But we're always using these sites to test what's the best way to look at soil health. Do we need to look at it differently? Is it microbiome? Do we need to look at mesofauna? Is it nematodes? How do we best assess carbon? Is it gas flux from the soil, which we are doing, and we know that we are actually outpacing the efflux from the soil by the fixation by the crop. So we know that. We've also proven that nitrous oxide is not an issue in low tillage practices as much as we thought. So that's really good. So we're not causing any more greenhouse gas emissions that we might not have thought about in the system. So that's just sort of a flavour of what you might be able to expect. And hopefully the kind of time point we're in, we're starting to see the problems turn up. So weed population changes. And now the sort of next focus of the trial is how do we improve the yield, the establishment, and fix any agronomic problems that are starting to occur? Because generally there hasn't been huge difference agronomically. Primarily it's weed populations, as you would imagine.
Suntem în cursul celui de-al 3-lea an de experiență în câmp în România. De fapt, este o cercetare în câmp, o cercetare în condiții reale, dar avem deja primele rezultate. Aș vrea să te invit să împărtășești aceste rezultate preliminare. Sigur că așteaptă să le finalizăm după încheierea ultimului an din protocol, dar totuși principalele, avem câteva concluzii.
So how does it look in sort of a Romanian
în România?
Yeah, so obviously completely different environment to all those other countries we talked about. Probably most similar to Spain and arid climate, extreme weather patterns, lower soil organic carbon, so lower organic matter. But the setup in the other countries has been very much looking at a plough versus a min-till with cover crops, which is actually the treatment we're doing with yourselves. Reduced tillage, not light till. And the Romanian style trials that we've got 6 farms, 3 in the north, 3 in the south for different soil climatic conditions. One farm will do the conventional system. One farm has just started out doing min-till, so they're novices, it's first year, they're trying a completely new system. Their system might not be ready, i.e. their equipment, their expertise, their soil, but they're changing practice, so they're in transition. And then the third is the same again, min-till plus cover crops, but they've been doing it for 5 years plus, maybe longer in many cases. So they're experts, they know what they're doing, their fields have gone through a potential transitional period and they're sort of starting to get more established. And so our assessment base is very much similar to all the other countries. We're trying to look at what happens in those systems to the full crop cycle, to the farmer's business as well. So that's the layout. And obviously we've got some preliminary results so far. The thing to say is that these are very preliminary. We've only just done second harvest. We've had extreme weather. And we've got to do, I would say, at least 5 years for baseline. And then that's when we start getting really the in-depth information. But already you can see there are some differences to what we had in the other countries. One of which is an increase in operations. And this is primarily due to when we go from a conventional to a light till system, they've opted to do more mechanical hoeing, so it's more mechanical weeding. So obviously that puts operations up. But as you can see, even the first farmers are doing a lot of benefit by changing system. And even with mechanical weeding, we're still having a huge fuel saving, purely because we're not pulling a plough through the soil anymore. But again, we're still getting benefits to the soil structure. And here in Romania, you can really see that benefit to soil. The vesicles have drastically increased. Earthworm numbers are fantastic. And we've really increased that level of surface mulch, which will then go in and build carbon. The main issue, on top of obviously the glaring red result there, being the yield, that's mostly down to the fact that we had a few sites that had full crop failure, and that's obviously inflated the results. The other thing is, because that's been dictated by extreme dry weather, the other problem, especially for Romania, has been how do you get green cover crops to establish? How do you know when to destroy them? Because if you do get them established, and we have done, it's then try and destroy them quite early for your region, because if you destroy it any later than December, you're starting to run out of moisture. That's affecting your spring cropping, that's affecting your yield. So it's putting it in early enough to get at least 3 months of green cover from that input, but then getting it out of the way ready for the crop cycle so the impact is not too large and the cycle will build carbon and build carbon slowly. This has been similar to the Iberians, where with lower yields, heightened temperatures, they have been slower than the wetter climates at building carbon, but they are. The key is to try and fit the green cover crops in there. But if we look at this data and just, say, okay, there's been a few sites, they've had some issues, it's not the system necessarily, it's just the climatic conditions and the year. What happens to the numbers if we take those out? And we can just have a look there. Obviously, this is not ideal, but if we look at more a relative scenario, this is quite nice to show the transition and more a similar pattern to all the other countries, where yes, there is a slight impact to yield, but when you've got higher levels of expertise, that impact is reduced, so productivity can be maintained. But where you're starting out and transitioning, you're going to have more of an impact on yield. So it's then, how do you get around that problem? So talking to yourselves as experts in this area, talking to your local neighbours who may be adopting these practices, and learning locally and learning from experts, and making sure with a transition, you take it slowly and gradually so that you can test the system, improve it before going full transition into a new system. There's still a way to go. All the 5-year projects that started right at the start are transitioning to a style of trial where we're looking at how do you change the advice and the input to increase the yield, increase that establishment, so that you could have complete green right across that board. Green to the environment, green to the wallet, green to the fuel use, green to the yield. And that's really going to be our focus going forwards. Obviously, this is just a very small snapshot, but it's extremely exciting work with yourselves, and it's great to get it in a region where this is the only one we have. These 6 farms are such useful information for us because they're giving us a much better understanding for a completely different climate, a different soil type, and a different sort of farming system.
Cred că acest proiect este extrem de relevant pentru ce așteaptă fermierii din România, pentru că, să o spunem, lucrările minime, acoperirea solului nu erau neapărat foarte comune până acum câțiva ani în România. Sigur, ele devin o modă, ele devin o cerință, ele devin o așteptare a societății europene, iar sistemul de ecoscheme din România, el însuși, încorporează o serie de elemente enumerate de tine în cadrul acestui proiect și care constituie piloni ai agriculturii regenerative. Îți mulțumesc, Max, pentru prezența în podcastul din cadrul Congresului de la Fermier pentru Fermieri. La anul, pe vremea aceasta, cred că vom avea rezultate finale și putem da mai multe certitudini fermierilor profesioniști din Forumul Agricultorilor și Procesatorilor Profesioniști din România.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.